In 1099 after Christ, the Jews and Muslims fought together to defend Jerusalem against the invading Crusaders from Europe. They were unsuccessful, and the Crusaders entered the city and proceeded to massacre the remaining Jewish and Muslim civilians and pillaged and destroyed mosques and the city itself. This started 200 years of crusades that were bloodier and bloodier with each century. About 100 years later, the Catholic Church set up inquisitions, which were attempts to convict heretics such as Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their Jewish or Muslim faith. Christian healers, called witches, using natural healing practices, were also considered heretics. Any Christian could accuse any other Christian of heresy merely on suspicions without having to show any evidence. During the Inquisition, the accused were psychologically and physically tortured until they died or confessed their sins and incriminated other people of heresy. Then they would be imprisoned for long periods, fined large amounts of money, and forced to wear a mark showing that they had sinned. Those that did not confess and survive their torture were burnt alive. This barbaric cruel practice lasted for the next 700 years. Genghis Khan, at about the 3-meter mark in the Think Park, was born in 1160 after Christ in Mongolia. He learned how to ride horses before he could walk. By 6, he could hunt and fish. He was able to unite and organize many nomadic tribes. He grouped them into gangs of 10, bands of 100, and battalions of 1,000. He commanded a league of 10 battalions, considered the most powerful and feared army of his time. One of the Chinese emperors hired his army, and they prospered and became famous for their fierce fighting power. They ended up breaching the Great Wall of China and conquered the entire country, and his empire covered almost all of Asia. Genghis Khan and his armies bridged Western Europe with Asia, allowing the two cultures to mix and trade. They were like bakers baking bread to nourish humanity and raise it to great new heights. In 1349, the Black Death, one of the worst pandemics in human history, killing half of the population, reached Switzerland, and the Swiss blamed the Jews for starting it, accusing them of poisoning water wells. A systematic extermination program was started, and Jews were burnt alive at the stake and their wealth was expropriated. This fear, hatred, blame, extermination, and expropriation spread with the plague to the rest of Europe like a wildfire. At the 2-meter mark of the Think Park, one very clever man called Gutenberg was born in 1398 and developed a machine that was able to mass-produce indulgences. He used the Mongolian invention of paper, discovered over 1,000 years before. He carved mirror images of the letters of the alphabet on wooden blocks and aligned them to form text. He covered the blocks with ink and pressed their images on paper to print and mass-produce indulgences that made him and the church very rich. He used his wealth to mass-produce Bibles that were in Latin, and except for a few priests, only a few people could read them. The printing presses and the books they produced in local languages after Gutenberg died lighted and fired men's minds all over the world. Knowledge exploded, and many thinking people began to think and to write books to complain of their exploitation. Christians that protested kept their God but rejected their church leaders. They were called Protestants. Over the centuries, they kept on protesting, eventually forming thousands of separate groups. Over time, empires divided and gradually regrouped into smaller groups called nations. People all over the world began to struggle against the exploitation and slaughter to fight for their freedom. By 1500 after Christ, the greed of mankind evolved to great heights. They were able to build and sail ships over the oceans. They used the Mongolian invention of the compass, developed over 1,700 years before, to be able to navigate back home. One enterprising queen saw that she could exploit this new technology to discover new lands to exploit. She sent one poor brave man called Columbus, born in 1451, to explore the world for new lands to exploit. Columbus discovered a continent filled with gold and fertile farmland. He conquered the land and called it America. Martin Luther, born in 1483 in Germany, was a priest who believed that sin cannot be bought off by buying indulgences. He used Gutenberg's old printing press to print the Bible in German to be read by the masses for the very first time. Many people reading the Bible for the first time had a differing interpretation of it and felt that Jesus deserved more exaltation, and that Mary, his mother, was unduly glorified, and that luxurious temples filled with gold statues and paintings of nude angels were not appropriate as churches. Luther, like many other priests, did not like to lead a celibate life, so with time they protested, broke away from the church, and became Protestants. They built their own less pretentious temples and traded the nude statues for wives. Luther tried to convert Jews to accept Jesus as their Messiah, and the more the Jews stubbornly refused to accept Jesus, the more Luther saw Jews as a cancer that must be eradicated from Germany. He printed many pamphlets calling for the marking of all Jews by making them wear a yellow armband. Later, he even proposed burning their homes and called for their extermination. Galileo Galilei, born in 1564, studied Aristotle and learned from him that heavier things fall faster than lighter things. He made experiments from a tall tower with different materials, from balls filled with lead to balls filled with air, and discovered that they all fell at the same rate. Aristotle also claimed that the sun rotated around the earth. Galileo studied the heavens and discovered that the earth rotated around the sun, just like a Polish astronomer Copernicus wrote 50 years before. Galileo invented many instruments that later allowed scientists to explore the unknown. He observed that light and images are shrunk and expanded by polished glass. He made large pendulum devices that measured time very exactly in order to measure the motion of stars. He observed and theorized a law called the law of inertia, refuting Aristotle's claim that bodies in motion gradually lose their motion and eventually end up still.